So Geoff, when did you first encounter Bonhoeffer's work?
Well, I first encountered his work while I was an undergraduate. And that was when Letters and Papers from Prison was published in the late 1950s. And I became very interested, not just in what he'd done in his 40 short years, but also in the ideas that went with those actions, which were very, very much something that were on my wavelength as somebody who saw Christianity as being doing things and not simply having beliefs.
Brilliant. And what do you think it was about those ideas that made such a deep impression on you?
Well, I think because my vision of the just society was one we had to work for.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in the issues that he was involved with in action in the 1930s particularly. And I wanted really to know more about how he came to those views, which was something that was discussed, of course, not just by me, but by many other people.
Yeah, I can imagine it was something that lots of people were talking about at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so can you tell me a bit about what you did after university and,
Well,
how you
after
carried
university, the
those ideas
first
with
thing
you?
I did was go and work for the SCM. I worked for a couple of years, 3 years, I think, for the SCM in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mostly as a field staff member in Northwest England. A very interesting experience and one I enjoyed thoroughly. Towards the end of it, I was offered an opportunity to go and work for the international SCM in South America as the fraternal secretary of the SCM, still a very small and nascent organization in Bolivia.
And were you thinking much about Bonhoeffer during your time in Bolivia?
Oh, yes. In fact, it was part of the SCM's policy, both nationally and internationally, to try to bring into focus some of Bonhoeffer's ideas. And in Bolivia, that was particularly about renewing the universities.
Mm-hmm.
And what needed to begin to happen to change what were medieval institutions into places of learning for the 20th century. Some of that project was funded by UNESCO, and it was a very interesting thing to be engaged with.
That must have been such a incredible and fascinating time to be working there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it was, as I say, it was almost directly the kind of method and thesis that Bonhoeffer himself would have supported.
Absolutely. And who were you like working alongside, and what were they saying about Bonhoeffer and his theology?
Well, to begin with, it was largely the Protestant liberal churches, the main one being the Methodist Church.
Mm-hmm.
But more and more it became something that crossed boundaries and even included the Catholic community, in that one or two people came to work on the project and work with us. And that was also connected with the other big theme, which everybody has heard about, which began in those days, not necessarily just in Bolivia, of liberation theology, which
Absolutely.
I'm sure you know about.
And what were the liberation theologians saying about Bonhoeffer?
Well, they varied enormously. From those for whom it was the way forward for the church in Latin America, people like Jose Miguel Bonino, here's my memory failing me, Castro, not the Castro,
Yeah.
what's his name? Emilio Castro.
Brilliant.
And others as well, Leonardo Franco, the Barbieris, various people right across the continent. And that was work which was able to go on in countries where there was a fairly liberal government. Alas, in the years while I was there, many of those countries became military dictatorships for reasons to do with the power that the United States had over those countries and their economies.
And what was that situation like in Bolivia?
It became very oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
It was about the time that my contract came to an end, and it wouldn't have been, well, it wasn't practical to go back to Bolivia to continue with that work, much as I might have grabbed it with both hands had there been a chance to do so.
That's a real shame.
And sorry.
Oh, so that's a shame. It's a shame that
That's
you
a shame. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I left about the time that Che Guevara
mm-hmm.
was murdered by the military junta in Bolivia.
Wow. Wow.
So it tells you a little bit about that period.
It's turbulent times. And if you kind of look at maybe how you're reading Bonhoeffer and his work during your time at university, and then what you were kind of thinking during your time working in Bolivia, do you think that changed at all? What impression did your time in Bolivia leave?
I think the impression I came away with was that Bonhoeffer, for me, was not about the past or even mm-hmm. the recent past, but about looking to the future and what kind of future, and engaging people of all ideas and persuasions.
Yeah.
That thinking was really the heart of becoming fully human. One of the challenging questions that Bonhoeffer asks is, who is man, and what kind of humanity are we seeking to build up in the world in which we live? Questions which are still as relevant today in a different context as they were then.
It's always seemed to me that he's very concerned with, who is it that we become and how we kind of shape ourselves and the future and so on. Mm-hmm. Jumping ahead a little bit, a few years, how did Project Bonhoeffer come about?
Well, when I left Bolivia, I needed to start to have a working life. Mm-hmm. I was married. I had a young son, and I went into academic life, largely as an anthropologist, and that took a lot of my time for quite a number of years. At which point, although I was a senior friend of the SCM in this country, I had little direct involvement with it for perhaps 20 years. Mm-hmm. And at the end of that, I began to ask myself, what's happened to the SCM? What's happened to those ideas that were so powerful and significant in the life of the movement 20 years ago? And came to the view that somehow Bonhoeffer had fallen into the background. Mm-hmm. That there'd been not not a decline, but a change of gear towards much more, what they called it ecumenism, I think, ideas about the church and how it should be, rather less about the world and how it should be. And when the opportunity came that I could do something about that, had the time and a little bit of resource to work on it, what I've been concerned about is what we now do to reawaken that spirit of Bonhoeffer that was so important at the time of the 60s and thereabouts, and which seem to have been lost.
I guess you could say Bonhoeffer's theology is very kind of outward looking. You know, it's about the place of not just the church kind of within itself, but the church in the world and how we can change things. Oh
yes, and I think I became much more a secular man than a church person at that period. As I'd got to know who I was, it became easier to ask questions of people who I thought might know about Bonhoeffer and what they were concerned to see happen with his inheritance.
Can you sort of slightly on this topic, do you think you've been quite influenced then by the phrase like religionless Christianity, and what would that mean to you?
I'm one of those people who thinks the word religionless Christianity is not a very good phrase, because it sounds as if somebody who is important is being deprived of something. And I think the debate about religionless Christianity and about the whole God is no more debate was that it kind of sidetracked away from what kind of world are we living in, and what kind of change do we really want to see. And it was for that Jesus of Nazareth was working through his life, for that change, not to convert people to a particular point of view, particularly not a religious point of view, had very little to say about religion as such. And it seems to me that, our ability now to ask those questions, particularly because we are now at another of those turning points in the history of not just our country, but the world, when we need to have good answers that care for people and their quality of life, just as we needed them perhaps 60 years ago.
I think you're right. We've sort of found ourselves in another moment of crisis, almost, much as Bonhoeffer did, although in a very different kind of way.
Oh yes, I'm not suggesting we go back and do what Bonhoeffer did. I'm suggesting we take his principles. His principles is not a good word for it, but anyhow, if we go back to where he was talking about faith and discipleship and all that means, we build on that our own life of discipleship, just as he did himself.
Absolutely. And so just to kind of come back to Project Bonhoeffer, can you say a little bit about the sort of projects that you've been involved with and how you're helping students and young people to do that?
Well, we began by trying, I think, as Project Bonhoeffer 10 years ago, with a small amount of money to to create a group of people who shared our approach to faith and action.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the SCM has a program called the Faith in Action program. And that we've supported through a number of different phases to build up both the faith and the action. And I think really what we're looking to do now is to bring the two together so that you don't think of one causing the other or vice versa. You think of them as being as one.
Yes, you could say kind of faith as lived out through action. It's not sort of separating them as such.
It's not separating them. In fact, one is of the essence of the other.
Yeah. Our faith kind of, our action embodies it, our faith almost.
So I don't know whether that helps, but that's the way we've come to this. And nor do we want to tell young people today how to live their lives. What we want to do is to enable them to do what they think is going to be something significant for them and for the people with whom they live.
Yeah.
And so it can be local, it can be national, and it can be international. You know, being able to use Zoom or something like that to share ideas, to talk about projects that care for people and create the just, caring society of people who want to live their lives to the greatest benefit of themselves and other people, which is what I think Jesus was talking about in the Sermon on the Mount,
yes,
about which Bonhoeffer had a great deal to say. So it's that kind of bringing togetherness that Project Bonhoeffer is there to do. It may not be there forever because it's not a huge organization with a lot of money, but in the time we can exist, I think those are the things that are critical for us.
Absolutely. And so my last question would be that if there's kind of one thing that you wanted my generation to understand about Bonhoeffer and his life and work, what do you think that would be?
That is a very hard question to answer.
I'm sorry.
I think what I'd say is that I'm sure the issues to do with social justice will continue to be very important ones, whether they're to do with race, immigration, or any other of those kind of agenda things that have been part of the life of the SCM for many years. But I think, you know, it's not just getting women priests, for example, that's important. It's not just what goes on in the church. It's what goes on beyond the church's doors that perhaps we need to be engaged with as part of our Christian mission, if that's the right word for it.
Yeah.
So I think those are the one set of things. The others are clearly to do with climate, and the risks that humanity is taking with the resources given to it to have a good life and a life of quality and all the things that nature has given us. I think what I'd be concerned about is that at the moment there's far too little obvious public concern about these things. Oh, there are people who are very concerned, but a relatively small minority. And I think that is going to be an area for education, for very many of the new technologies that we need to safeguard people as change takes place, as it will take place. And there may be many other things as well. I'm no expert on this, but those are the two areas that I think are most critical. There are many others. I'm not suggesting they're the only ones, but those are the two that I would pick out for special mention.
So we sort of need to take what we can learn from Bonhoeffer and kind of carry that forward into the issues of our age, which, as you say, are kind of climate and justice. And I think those two are quite linked, actually. You know, climate also is a global justice issue in some ways.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, I don't think I came into the world to change the world, but I'm having at least some sense in the way I think the SCM has traditionally worked and could continue to do in bringing people together, whether they were at one stage in the churches, bringing people together to deal with issues like race and ethnicity.
Yeah.
And I think this is another area where we've got to think and act together, as Bonhoeffer would have done.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Geoff. It's been a pleasure to talk and to hear a bit about how you came across Bonhoeffer and your life and how that's all kind of fit together.
Thank you.